Her Christmas cookie was laughed at in front of the whole town, until one man said, "It tastes like home." "You're going to that social tonight, Grace? And you're taking those ridiculous cookies with you?" Grace looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been carefully shaping gingerbread dough into tiny elephants. Her stepmother Judith stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face set in that expression Grace knew too well, the one that meant arguing was pointless. "I don't think that's a good idea," Grace said quietly, returning her attention to the cookie in her hands. She was adding the final touches to the trunk, the way her father had taught her years ago. "The last time I went to a town gathering." "The last time you hid in the corner like a mouse," Judith interrupted sharply. "Tonight, you'll actually try to be useful. Maybe someone desperate enough will take you off my hands." Grace's fingers stilled on the dough. She'd heard variations of this her entire life since her father died, and Judith became her guardian. Or rather, her burden. "I'm 24, Judith. Most men in this town are already married or unwilling to look at you." "Yes, I know." Judith walked to the table, examining the elephant-shaped cookies with thinly veiled disgust. "Why do you still make these childish shapes? Your father's been dead for 6 years. It's pathetic." Grace felt the familiar sting behind her eyes but refused to let tears fall. Her father had owned a small bakery in town before the fever took him. He'd taught her to shape cookies into animals to make children smile. "Because some people still believe a little joy is worth something," she said. Judith snorted. "Joy doesn't pay rent. Joy doesn't put food on the table. You know what does? A husband. So you're going tonight? You're bringing these absurd cookies, and you're going to smile and be pleasant for once in your miserable life. Do you understand?" Grace understood perfectly. Judith had been increasingly cruel these past months, ever since Mr. Henderson from the mill had started paying her attention. A widow with a grown stepdaughter wasn't as appealing as a widow living alone. "Yes, ma'am," Grace whispered. "But, and for heaven's sake, try to look presentable. Wear the blue dress. It hides some of your problems." Judith swept out of the kitchen, leaving Grace alone with her elephant cookies and her father's memory. Later that evening, the town hall blazed with candlelight and the scent of pine. Grace stood near the dessert table, her plate of elephant cookies looking small and out of place among the elaborate cakes and pastries the other women had brought. She recognized Mrs. Preston's perfect sugar cookies, decorated with royal icing that must have taken hours. Mrs. Crawford's layered cake sat in the center, commanding attention. And then there were Grace's elephants. Simple. Childish. Wrong. She was already regretting coming when she heard it. A small, delighted gasp. "Mama, look. Elephant cookies." A little girl, maybe 7 years old, had broken away from her mother and was standing in front of Grace's plate, her eyes wide with wonder. Before Grace could respond, the child looked up at her with a gap-toothed smile. "Did you make these, ma'am? Can I taste one?" Grace's heart squeezed. "Of course, sweetheart." The girl took one carefully, as if it were made of glass, and bit into it. Her face transformed into pure joy. "It's delicious." She turned and called to a group of children nearby. "Come see. They're elephants." Within moments, 4 more children had gathered around Grace's table, their excitement creating a small bubble of happiness that Grace hadn't felt in months. "How did you make the trunk? Can I have the baby elephant? These are the prettiest cookies here." Grace found herself smiling, really smiling, as she answered their questions, told them about her father, watched them carefully select their favorite elephants. "Mama, come see," the first little girl called, waving enthusiastically. Mrs. Preston approached, and Grace's smile began to fade. She knew that look. She'd seen it 1,000 times. Mrs. Preston's eyes moved from the elephant cookies to Grace, and her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Elephant cookies?" she said loudly, her voice cutting through the conversations around them. "How fitting." The room began to quiet. Other women drifted closer. "Did a child make these?" Mrs. Crawford asked, barely suppressing a laugh. Elephant cookies from an elephant woman, Mrs. Preston continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall now. I suppose it makes sense. The laughter started then. Sharp, deliberate, meant to wound. Grace felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the familiar shame creeping up her neck. The little girl's smile faded. But they're good, Mama. Mrs. Preston grabbed her daughter's hand. Don't eat any more. Spit it at them. Now. But. I said now. The other mothers descended like crows, pulling their children away from Grace's table. Small faces turned back, confused and sad, as they were dragged toward the acceptable desserts. Grace stood frozen, watching her father's memory being rejected again. The elephants he'd loved. The joy he'd believed in. All of it, worthless. Mrs. Preston returned to Grace's table, her face set with righteous disgust. She reached for the plate, her intention clear. These need to go in the trash, she announced. I won't have my children eating food touched by someone like you. A hand caught her wrist mid-reach. What are you doing? The voice was deep, calm, and carried an edge that made everyone in the room go still. Grace looked up to see a tall man she didn't recognize. Rough hands, sun-weathered face, the bearing of someone who spent his life working land rather than attending socials. He'd caught Mrs. Preston's wrist gently but firmly, stopping her from throwing away Grace's cookies. Mrs. Preston recovered quickly. Mr. Garrett, this doesn't concern. You were about to throw away food, he said, releasing her wrist and reaching for one of the elephant cookies. Seems wasteful. He bit into it. The entire room watched in silence. Grace watched his face, waiting for the polite grimace, the forced smile, the quick disposal when he thought she wasn't looking. Instead, his eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they found hers. This tastes like home, he said. Like my grandmother's kitchen when I was a boy. He picked up the entire plate. Mrs. Preston's mouth opened. Mr. Garrett, surely you don't need. I do need. He looked at Grace. Who taught you to make these shapes? Grace's voice came out barely above a whisper. My father. He taught you well. Jake turned to face the room, the plate of elephant cookies in his hands. Shame none of you could see that. The silence that followed was deafening. Then he looked back at Grace. May I call on you tomorrow, miss? Grace could only nod, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He tipped his head politely and walked out of the hall with her cookies, leaving Grace standing at her table and an entire room full of people staring after him in shock. Christmas morning came with a cold awakening. Pack your things. You're leaving. Now. Grace woke to Judith's voice cutting through the cold Christmas morning air. She sat up in her narrow bed, confused. Through the window, pale winter light barely touched the frost-covered glass. What? Judith stood in the doorway of Grace's small room, already dressed, her face hard as stone. You heard me. Pack whatever you can carry and get out of my house. Grace's mind struggled to catch up. Yesterday, the social, the mockery, Jake Garrett taking her cookies. She'd walked home in a daze while Judith had stalked ahead in furious silence. Judith, it's Christmas morning, which you ruined last night. Judith stepped into the room, her voice low and venomous. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Standing there like some pathetic fool while the entire town laughed at you? And then that rancher making a spectacle, as if your cookies were something special? He was being kind. He was pitying you. Judith's composure cracked. And now everyone in town knows that Judith Cartwright's stepdaughter is the laughingstock of Silver Creek. They'll associate me with your, sir. She gestured at Grace with disgust. I won't have it. Not anymore. Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my concern. You're 24 years old, a grown woman. Figure it out. Judith turned toward the door. You have 1 hour. Anything you don't take, I'm burning. Judith, please. Should have thought about that before you embarrassed me. The door slammed shut. Grace sat frozen for a long moment, then forced herself to move. Her hands shook as she pulled out the small canvas bag her father had given her years ago. She packed quickly, 2 dresses, underclothings, her father's recipe book, the small tin box with his photograph inside. Everything she owned fit into one bag. When she emerged from her room, Judith was waiting by the front door. "Leave the key," Judith said coldly. Grace set the house key on the side table, her throat too tight to speak. "And Grace," Judith's voice stopped her at the threshold. "Don't come back. I'm done pretending to care what happens to you." The door shut behind her with finality. Grace stood on the frozen street, her bag clutched in one hand, breath misting in the December air. The town was quiet, most families still inside, celebrating Christmas morning together. She had nowhere to go. No family. No friends. The little money she'd saved was in the tin box, maybe enough for a week at the boarding house, and then, she didn't let herself finish that thought. Her feet moved automatically, carrying her toward the town center. Maybe Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house would take pity on her. Maybe. "Miss." Grace turned. A rider approached on a dark horse, and even before he came fully into view, she recognized him. Jake Garrett, the man from last night. He pulled his horse to a stop beside her, taking in her bag, her obvious distress. "What happened?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke her. "My stepmother, I no longer have a place to live." His jaw tightened. "She threw you out? On Christmas?" Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he made a decision. "My ranch is 3 miles west of here. I have a guest cabin, small, but it's warm and it's empty. You can stay there." "I can't." "In exchange," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "you could cook for my ranch hands. I've got 6 men who can't make anything edible to save their lives. Room and board in exchange for cooking. Fair work for fair pay. Nothing improper about it." Grace looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes were steady, honest. He wasn't looking at her the way the town did. He was offering her work. Dignity. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't know me." "I know you make cookies shaped like elephants to honor your father," he said quietly. "I know your stepmother is cruel. And I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." He held out his hand. "So what do you say? You need a place. I need a cook." Seems straightforward to me. Grace looked at his outstretched hand, then at the empty street behind her. The town that had never wanted her. The stepmother who'd finally gotten rid of her. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him on the horse, her bag secured. As they rode out of town, Grace looked back once at the house that had never been a home. Then she turned forward. At the ranch, the cabin was small but clean, 1 room with a bed, a stove, a table. Infinitely better than the street. "Kitchen's in the main house," Jake said, setting her bag inside. "You'll cook there. Men eat at dawn, noon, and sunset. Sunday's off. The cabin's yours, your own space. Nobody bothers you here." "Thank you," Grace said and meant it. Jake paused at the door. Those elephant cookies. They really did taste like home. Then he was gone, leaving Grace alone in her new cabin on Christmas Day. She sat on the bed and, for the first time in years, allowed herself to hope. 1 week passed at the ranch, and Grace found herself settling into a rhythm she'd never known. "You burned the bacon again, boss." Jake looked down at the charred strips in the pan and sighed. It had been his turn to cook breakfast, and apparently he still hadn't improved since Grace arrived a week ago. Grace's voice came from behind him, warm with amusement. "Step aside before you burn down the kitchen." He turned to find her in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning cold, her face still soft with sleep. Something in his chest tightened. He stepped back from the stove without argument. She'd taken over the ranch kitchen completely, and his men had never been happier. Neither had he, if he was honest. "How do you make it look easy?" he asked. "My father. He could cook anything." Her voice went soft when she mentioned him. It always did. He said cooking was just another way of showing love. Jake leaned against the counter, content to watch her work. Tell me about him. She glanced at him, surprised. Over the past week, they'd talked, brief exchanges while she cooked, longer conversations when he'd linger after his men had eaten. But she'd never told him much about her father. My father owned a bakery, she said finally, cracking eggs into the pan. Best in town, everyone said. He'd let me help starting when I was 6 years old. Taught me every recipe he knew. The elephant shapes? A sad smile touched her lips. Those were his favorite. He'd make them for children's birthdays. He said a child's smile was worth more than gold. She paused. My mother died when I was 16. Consumption. My father remarried 2 years later, a widow named Judith. He thought I needed a mother's guidance. He died when I was 20. Same fever that took half the town. I'm sorry. Grace's hands moved mechanically now, her voice flat. Judith sold his bakery within a month. Said it was too much work. Kept all the money for herself. Jake felt anger kindle in his chest. Just like that. Just like that. I've been living with her since, cooking and cleaning to earn my keep. I've been trying to save enough to leave, but she takes most of what I earn from selling baked goods. Took, Jake corrected gently. Past tense. You're here now. You've never been on a horse? Jake stared at her in disbelief. Grace stood beside his gentlest mare, looking uncertain. My father had a cart for deliveries. We never needed. Everyone needs to know how to ride. He brought the mare closer. Come on. I'll teach you. What if I fall? Then I'll catch you. Something in his voice made her look up sharply, but he was already helping her mount, his hands steady on her waist. She settled into the saddle, gripping the pommel. Relax, he said, swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and Grace forgot how to breathe. I've got you. They rode slowly around the corral, his body warm against her back, his voice low in her ear as he explained how to sit, how to move with the horse. Grace tried to focus on his words instead of how safe she felt in his arms. You're a natural, he said after a while. Liar. But she was smiling. You made me laugh 3 times this week, he said quietly. That's more than anyone's managed in 2 years. Grace turned her head slightly. What happened 2 years ago? His arms tightened fractionally around her. My wife left. Said ranch life was too isolating, too hard. She wanted city life, society, things I couldn't give her. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Grace heard the old pain beneath it. She was probably right. She was wrong, Grace said firmly. This place is beautiful. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, it is. But he wasn't looking at the ranch when he said it. They sat by the fireplace in the main house, his men having gone to town for the New Year's celebration. Grace had stayed, and so had Jake. Why didn't you go with them? She asked. Didn't want to. He was staring into the fire. Why didn't you? Wasn't invited. She said it lightly, but they both knew what she meant. Jake turned to look at her then, the firelight casting shadows across his face. Grace. She met his eyes, and something electric passed between them. He leaned closer. She didn't pull away. Then he stopped, an inch from her lips, his jaw tight. No, he said roughly, pulling back. Not like this. Not while you work for me. It wouldn't be right. Grace's heart was pounding. Jake. Good night, Grace. He stood quickly and left, leaving her alone by the fire. She touched her lips, almost feeling the kiss that hadn't happened, and realized with startling clarity, she was in love with Jake Garrett. And that terrified her more than anything. The 3rd week brought trouble Grace hadn't expected. Sheriff's here, boss. And he doesn't look happy. Jake looked up from mending fence to see his ranch hand Tommy pointing toward the house. Sure enough, Sheriff Morrison sat on his horse near the main house, And beside him were Deputy Collins and Mrs. Helen Dalton, the mayor's wife. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew. Somehow he just knew. He dropped the fence post and walked toward them, his mind already racing. Grace was in the kitchen preparing lunch. He could see her through the window, humming as she worked. "Sheriff," Jake said evenly. "What can I do for you?" Sheriff Morrison dismounted, his face apologetic but firm. "Jake, I'm sorry about this, but I've got to talk to your cook." "Grace." "About what?" "Just bring her out, please." Jake's jaw tightened, but he went to the kitchen. Grace looked up as he entered, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "The sheriff wants to talk to you," he said quietly. Her face went pale. "Why?" "I don't know. But I'm right here. Come on." They walked out together. Grace froze when she saw Mrs. Dalton sitting primly on her horse, her face set in righteous judgment. "Miss Grace," Sheriff Morrison said uncomfortably, "I've received a complaint. A serious one." "What complaint?" Jake demanded. Mrs. Dalton spoke up, her voice carrying across the yard. "The complaint that this young woman is living on your property, Mr. Garrett. Unmarried. Unchaperoned. In a state of moral corruption." "That's insane," Jake said flatly. "She has her own cabin. She's my cook." "She lives on your property," Mrs. Dalton interrupted. "She spends hours alone with you daily. The entire town is talking about it." "Let them talk. It's indecent, Mr. Garrett. Against community standards." Sheriff Morrison sighed. "Jake, her stepmother filed formal charges. Moral corruption. I have to take her in." Jake stepped in front of Grace. "On what evidence?" "She's living here, isn't she?" Mrs. Dalton's voice was sharp. "That's evidence enough. She's an employee. With her own room inside your home?" Mrs. Dalton pressed. "Her own cabin 50 yards from the main house," Jake corrected coldly. "Still your property. Still unchaperoned." The mayor's wife turned to the sheriff. "Are you going to do your job, Sheriff Morrison, or do I need to report your negligence to my husband?" The sheriff's face reddened. "Miss Grace, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "No." Jake's voice was steel. "You're not taking her anywhere." "Jake, don't make this harder. She hasn't done anything wrong." Jake looked at his ranch hands, who'd gathered at the commotion. "Tommy, Marcus, James, you've all been here every day. Has Miss Grace done anything improper?" "No, sir," Tommy said immediately. The others echoed him. "She cooks and goes to her cabin," Marcus added. "That's all." "The word of hired men protecting their employer," Mrs. Dalton said dismissively. "Hardly credible." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "If you're arresting her for living here, then arrest me too. Same crime, same punishment." "Don't be ridiculous." "I mean it, Sheriff. If she goes, I go." Sheriff Morrison's face was pained. "Jake, you're making this worse. Let me take her in. The judge will be here next week. This'll all get sorted out." "Next week?" Grace's voice was small. "I'll be in jail for a week?" "I'm sorry, miss." Jake moved to stand beside her, his shoulder touching hers. "Then arrest me. Same cell." "Mr. Garrett," the sheriff said wearily, "step aside. Don't make me." "You want her?" Jake's voice dropped, dangerous. "You go through me first." Tommy and Marcus moved to stand behind Jake. Then James. Then the other hands, forming a wall between Grace and the sheriff. Sheriff Morrison looked at the line of men, then at Mrs. Dalton, then at Jake. "This is obstruction. This is protection of an innocent woman from false charges," Jake said coldly. The standoff held for a long moment. Then Mrs. Dalton spoke, her voice icy. "Sheriff, if you don't arrest her now, I'll have the mayor remove you from office by tomorrow." Sheriff Morrison's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry, Jake. I have to." He looked at Grace. "Please, miss. Don't make this harder." Grace put her hand on Jake's arm. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I'll go." Grace, no. I won't let you lose everything for me. She stepped forward, her chin up despite the tears in her eyes. I'll go with you, Sheriff. Like hell you will, Jake started. Mr. Garrett, Deputy Collins said, his hand moving to his gun. Don't. Jake watched, helpless and furious, as the sheriff helped Grace onto his horse. She looked back at him once, and the pain in her eyes nearly dropped him to his knees. I'll get you out, he called after her. I promise. But they were already riding away, Grace's figure growing smaller as they headed toward town and the jail cell that waited. Jake stood in his yard, surrounded by his men, and felt more powerless than he'd ever felt in his life. Tommy spoke quietly. What do we do, boss? Jake's jaw set. We go to town. And we end this. The next morning, Jake demanded an emergency town meeting. This town hall meeting is now in session. All citizens are welcome to speak. Mayor Robert Dalton's voice echoed through the packed hall. Every seat was filled, people standing along the walls. Grace sat in the front row, brought from her cell under guard, her hands folded in her lap. She'd spent the night in jail, lying on a hard cot, and had woken to the news that Jake had demanded an emergency town meeting. She spotted him now, standing near the back, his hat in his hands. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw the determined set of his jaw. Judith sat 3 rows behind Grace, her face smug and satisfied. Mayor Dalton continued. We're here to address the charges brought against Miss Grace by her stepmother, Mrs. Judith Cartwright. The charges state that Miss Grace has been living in sin with Mr. Jake Garrett. Jake stepped forward. I'd like to speak. Mr. Garrett, there's a process. I'm invoking my right as a citizen to address this assembly. Jake's voice carried to every corner of the room. Or is that not how this works anymore? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The mayor's face tightened, but he nodded. You have the floor. Jake walked to the front, stopping beside Grace's chair. He looked out at the assembled townspeople, neighbors, business owners, families. People he'd known for years. Grace has been arrested for living on my property, he began, his voice steady. Her stepmother filed charges of moral corruption. So let me tell you exactly what happened. He turned to look at Judith. 3 weeks ago, at the Christmas Eve social, Grace brought cookies shaped like elephants. Her father taught her to make them before he died. The children loved them. But you, he gestured to the crowd, you mocked her. Made her feel worthless. Again. Some faces looked down, ashamed. Others remained defiant. I took those cookies because they were the best I'd ever tasted. They reminded me of home, of family, of things I thought I'd lost. So I asked if I could see her again. He paused. The next morning, her stepmother threw her out. On Christmas Day. Because Grace had embarrassed her. Judith stood. That's not. Sit down, Jake said coldly. I'm not finished. The mayor gestured for Judith to sit. She did, her face red. Grace had nowhere to go. I offered her work, legitimate work, cooking from my ranch hands. I gave her a separate cabin, 50 yards from my house. For 2 weeks, she's cooked 3 meals a day for 7 men. That's all. Nothing improper. Nothing immoral. He looked at his ranch hands standing along the wall. Tommy, Marcus, James, you've all been there every day. Tell them. Has anything improper happened? No, sir, Tommy said loudly. Miss Grace is proper and kind. She works hard and minds her business. The others nodded agreement. Jake turned back to the crowd. So let's be honest about what this really is. This isn't about morality. This is about a stepmother who wanted to be rid of her burden. This is about a town that's been cruel to a woman whose only crime is not looking the way you think she should. His voice hardened. And I'm done with it. He turned to Grace, who was looking up at him with tears streaming down her face. He took her hand and pulled her gently to her feet. Grace, I'm sorry I'm doing this publicly, but I need everyone to hear this. His voice softened. These past 2 weeks, You've made my house feel like a home again. You've made me laugh. You've shown me kindness I didn't know I'd been missing. And somewhere between the elephant cookies and the terrible horse riding lessons, I fell in love with you." Grace's breath caught. Around them, the room had gone completely silent. "So I'm asking you right now in front of this whole town, will you marry me? Not because I have to. Not because of these charges. But because I want to spend every day of my life with you." Grace couldn't speak past the tears. She nodded frantically. "Say it," he said gently. "Let them hear you." "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." Jake pulled her into his arms, and the room erupted, some in applause, others in outrage. Judith shot to her feet. "This is over." The Reverend's voice cut through the noise. He stood from his seat near the back. "I'll marry them right now if they consent. Then there's no charge to answer, is there, Mayor?" The mayor looked at his wife, who sat stony-faced. I suppose not." "Then let's have a wedding," the Reverend said, walking to the front. Half the room stood to leave. Half stayed. Grace didn't care. She only saw Jake, looking at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had. They married in the town hall, with his ranch hands as witnesses and half of Silver Creek watching. When Jake kissed her, she tasted salt from her own tears and felt the weight she'd carried her whole life finally lift. 6 months later, Grace stood in the ranch kitchen, showing a thin, frightened young woman named Mary how to roll pie dough. "Like this," Mary whispered. "Exactly," Grace said, smiling. Jake watched from the doorway, pride in his eyes. The ranch had become their quiet mission, taking in those with nowhere to go. "Why did you help me?" Mary asked. "Because someone helped me once," Grace said gently. "Everyone deserves a place where they matter." That night, after Mary went to the small cabin Grace once lived in, Jake slipped his arms around her. "You're changing lives," he said. "We both are," she replied. He kissed her hair. "Your elephant cookies still taste like home." Grace smiled. "That's because you are home, Jake Garrett." And for the first time, she truly understood the word.